Our next session is called Into the Mind of the Biographer. We have with us Debashish Mukherjee, who's been a journalist for 40 years. He's also the author of The Disruptor, How Vishwanath Pratap Singh Shook India. Thank you for joining us, Debashish. We also have Rajiv Vijayakar, who is an author and columnist and recognized for his contributions to Hindi cinema and music. He has his latest book, Music by Lakshmikant Pyarelal, which is also available in our bookstore. Thank you for joining us, Rajiv. Next, we have Sugata Srinivas Raju, who is a bilingual journalist, editor, author, and columnist. And his latest book is Furrows in a Field, The Unexplored Life of H.D. Devegowda. They will be in conversation with Samant Subramanian, who is a writer and journalist. With that, over to you, Samant.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here on a stage with these three excellent journalists and biographers. I wanted to do something different from the usual panel discussion that we see in LitFest, which is just asking questions about the contents of the book and why people wrote this book and not that book and so on. I thought I would do something very different. And the idea here is actually, in fact, inspired by one of the presiding spirits of Bangalore, the Bangalore literary scene, Mr. Ramchandra Guha, who is here just in time, who has often kind of talked about how difficult it is to get good biography writing in India. And there's a number of reasons for this. The archives are not always up to speed. It's difficult to access them. Archivists are irrationally protective of the material that they have. Interviews, the art of the interview is an uncertain art over here. There's no sometimes there's a paucity of other literature to draw upon with which you can build your biography. All of these have been persistent problems for many years now. But fortunately, some of this is changing, and we are seeing a number of new good biographies come out. Chief among them, these three that we have here. There's a biography of Devegowda, there's a biography of Lakshmikant Pyarelal, the biography of VP Singh, all of which have come out this year alone. So you can imagine that there's a real sort of efflorescence in the genre today. But what I want to do is, the idea here is this: each of these gentlemen will read 2 to 3 pages of from their works. And then what we're going to do for you is have them walk us through the sourcing and the methodology with which they built those 2 pages. Where did the material come from? Who did they talk to? How did they cross-verify this fact or that? What were the challenges? Which has been the hardest fact to verify for them in the book that they've written? And so through this, I want to give you a sense of how painstaking and elaborate a biographer's art really is, and how much work these gentlemen put into writing their books and researching their books. So without further ado, that's what, I'm going to turn first to Sugata, who has written a biography of a local lad. And I hope, Sugata, you can read a couple of pages and then we can quickly talk about the methodology.
Thank you, Samant. I'll read a small passage from the book which refers to Gowda sleeping, because he was projected by the media as a sleeping prime minister. So I examined that as well in the book. So I'll read about that. Somnolence strategy. Gowda had his quirks. He gave too many appointments in a day, and maintaining the schedule became very difficult. He was a workaholic. He almost never slept. He was like that even as CM. As a result, in most meetings, he would get into a somnolent state. He would not exactly sleep, but to the rest of the world, he looked drowsy and disengaged. Officers could never figure out what this phenomena was, because at the end of the meeting, he would be on top of all facts and opinions expressed when he was seemingly away. Subramaniam mentions this. Subramaniam was his cabinet secretary. Subramaniam mentions this, quote, Devegowda was much misunderstood. In conferences and seminars, he would be portrayed as yawning prodigiously and even pictured in the midst of 40 wings. Having been with him on so many occasions, I can vouch for the fact that he was fully alert and alive to the issues under discussion. In general, his officers thought his attention span was about 20 minutes. beyond 20 minutes unless it was politics or meeting of the coordination committee of supporting parties. It was difficult to keep him engaged. The officers had to work around this problem. Meenakshi Sundaram narrated a story on this. The army people, I quote, the army people wanted to make a presentation. They asked for a half-day appointment. The army chief sent one of his deputies to meet me. I told him frankly that the Prime Minister's attention span does not exceed half an hour. Whatever important points you want to make it in the first half hour. That gentleman took it amiss. He said, IAS officers always block us. They never allow us to speak to the PM. We want to explain our problems. We need a minimum of 2 hours. Half an hour is not acceptable. I said, fine, it is your choice. We will give you half day. I went to Chandran. Chandran is the reference to Satish Chandran, the principal secretary. I went to Chandran and told him the problem. I wondered what would happen if the PM sleeps with the army people around. Chandran was unperturbed. He said he would attend the meeting and asked me to inform the defense secretary and through him ensure that the defense minister was present too. He added it was not prudent for the PMO to directly deal with defense issues. He said, you and I will sit with the PM. I will take care of all the subjects. If in between the PM dozes off, do not panic. At the end of the meeting, you get up and tell our principal secretary wants to make a few points. The PM will not object. So we came to an understanding as to how to handle the meeting. On the appointed day, the meeting began, and as expected, the army fellows started from 1952. By the time they finished history and reached Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister was disengaged. The gentleman who had sought appointment came and said, the PM is not listening. I said, I cannot do anything, and he could try wake him up if he wanted. However, I pacified him by saying, don't worry, the PM, when he wants to listen attentively, closes his eyes. You continue with the presentation. Your problems will be dealt with. At the appropriate time, the PM opened his eyes. The last 15 minutes, he was very alert. As per plan at the end, I told him that Chandran will summarize. PM2 said the principal secretary should react first to the presentation. Chandran did a brilliant job. He said whatever the army had said fell into 3 categories and offered some possible solutions. Then he asked the Prime Minister to address the gathering. The PM brilliantly picked up not only from what Chandran had said, but also from where Chandran had stopped. He added his perspective and assured all that was agreed would be done in a time-bound manner. He also politely asked the defense minister and the defense secretary for their views. They agreed with the PM and his principal secretary. Then the PM got up, broke protocol, and went around shaking hands with everyone in the room, irrespective of their rank and seniority. The army delegation went back happy. Gujral's attention span was longer, but it was not helpful. Vajpayee too, like Gowda, did not have a great attention span. It was less than half an hour. Like we covered for Gowda, most of the time, Jashwant Singh and Brajesh Mishra covered for Vajpayee. They were very dedicated to him and he trusted them fully. On the sleep issue, unquote, on the sleep issue, Gowda picked a story to tell from his mentor, Morarji's autobiography. Not so much to defend himself, but to point out that it was a very human thing to happen. Morarji had recounted how Pandit Nehru had fallen asleep in a meeting with John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State. Dulles had apparently felt so offended that he went to Pakistan and made a deal to supply military equipment. Quote, this is, I'm quoting Deve Gowda, quote, Panditji was a great man, but he too felt tired and exhausted at times. Can we hold it against him? I had a serious problem. I could not take light directly falling on my eyes, but invariably there would be a lot of light falling on me when I sat on the dais or in a meeting. Most of the time I kept my eyes shut and listened carefully, and sometimes I did feel exhausted. I always had this anxiety that I had very little time on the PM's chair. So I worked till late in the night against the advice of my family and doctors. I would see files till late in the night and it had its implications. I may have kept my eyes shut at times, but God ensured I did not make blunders. Unquote. Last paragraph. Gowda's cabinet colleagues, like P. Chidambaram, said that although the popular story was that he dozed off, he never actually did. Quote, I don't think he dozed off. He was quite alert. That was his style. The head would drop, but the moment his subject came, he would perk up. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was finance minister then, also endorsed this. Quote, he had this habit of looking very sleepy, but I think he was very attentive. He appeared to be in the somnolent kind of state, but one ear was always open. Whenever something needed to be said, he would say it, and then one realized he had not missed anything. Thank you.
Terrific. This is such a great example of what a good biography ought to do, which is to ascertain the facts, and if they run counter to the popular narrative, you have to somehow, you have to present your argument against the popular narrative and upend it. But conversely, when you're trying to do that, the burden of proof becomes much higher. Much higher. So, you've already quoted in this short passage, I think at least 4 people who have said, that this is not, the popular narrative is not entirely correct, that he was not dozing on the job, so to speak. So tell us about how you verified and cross-verified this. The reason I ask is this, we have writers here who work in politics and Bollywood. And in both industries, somebody is either being built up or being torn down. There is that notion of an unshakable truth is quite sort of non-existent. And so for you to be able to pin that down, how did you convince yourself to your own satisfaction that you had the right version of events?
Thank you, Sumant. So basically, I spoke to Deve Gowda about everything that had to be spoken to. I had to ask him everything, and I had an agreement with him, and which I write in the book, that I shall not show him a word of what I have written. And he was democratic enough not to interfere or intervene. So when I asked this thing about his sleeping thing, I in fact showed him a Indian Express picture, and I said, sir, this picture, which became made you very infamous, what do you have to say about it? His instant reaction was that, oh, Panditji, Nehru also slept. So, I was wondering where he got this from. So I did not immediately counter him and ask him, so why are you saying this? Is this part of the Delhi lore or anecdote or whatever that you've heard? So I sort of, I allowed him to speak, and then he spoke about his retina problem. He said, I had a medical problem, but I also had a useless media secretary in HK Dua who betrayed me. He never went out and explained that it was a medical problem. I could not take light into my eyes. My diabetes was very high. I had a huge problem. And I told my staff, my personal staff knew about it, but nobody bothered explaining. And as a prime minister, I don't offer explanations. So I never sort of went about correcting anybody. So then the next meeting I went to him after 3 weeks, I asked, so can you please again tell me, where did you get that anecdote about Panditji sleeping? I was surprised. He said, haven't you read my guru's autobiography, Morarji's autobiography, Macmillan, 2nd volume, page number 48, 3rd paragraph. Wow. That is the kind of photographic memory that man has, because I've also dealt with other things in the book where he speaks about river treaties. So he will tell you in the Congo, this treaty was signed, but everything is fine, but the last but one paragraph. So he has that kind of, some kind of gift. I don't understand how he gets it, but he looks at the sheet and he just puts it inside and he knows exactly what is there and he can sort of repeat it verbatim. So I went with the story to all these people I've quoted here. I asked Meenakshi Sundaram. He was his joint secretary. I asked Chidambaram. Chidambaram said, you believe that man slept? Chidambaram, how Chidambaram speaks, there's a bit of condescension also. He said, you think you really believe that man slept? He would pretend half the time he's sleeping because he wanted us to make mistakes. And then he would suddenly get up and he would revise the entire decision that has been made in the cabinet. And in fact, I elaborate in the book, Montek Singh Ahluwalia gives us an example about, he tells the finance secretary, what are you talking? Come, I'll take you to parties that are happening in the evening, and I'll show you how much gas. It's about gas subsidy. He's saying how much you should actually not subsidize is his argument. He's saying, I'll take you to tandoor parties in the evening. You see how much of gas is being spent by the elite of Delhi. So Montek is completely surprised about such things. So here, the problem is that you can't verify these things in the archives. You don't get documents or written things.
I was going to ask, I mean, do you have, for example, access to the minutes of a meeting?
Some meetings I did have access to because Meenakshi Sundaram was very meticulous and he kept papers, and I've actually reproduced, and Deve Gowda was in the habit of writing long handwritten notes to his secretaries. See, it's a very interesting thing because prime ministers don't leave a paper trail. And I have reproduced photographs of those papers where he's sitting in the Raj Bhavan waiting for John Major, and he's writing a 7-page note to his principal secretary saying what he wants done in the next 1 week.
And you had access to those notes.
And those notes were luckily with Mr. Meenakshi Sundaram. Mr. Deve Gowda, let me be honest, was very choosy in parting with his papers. Only when I asked for the Hegde papers, he was very happy, initially reluctant. He didn't know what my purpose was. He thought initially said, you're another English journalist who will run me down. So why should I share my papers? And then when he sort of, after 6 or 8 months, I think he trusted the process. And then he said, I can share some letters that I wrote to Hegde. And then he showed me those letters and I said, I cannot write without you giving me a photocopy of it. And then he very reluctantly, after 6 months, shared the photocopy of it. So that is the kind of thing. And see, the saddest part is I spent a lot of time at the Nehru Memorial Library and Museum, like everybody does. And our guru is sitting here. He taught us all to do it, Mr. Ram Guha. So I went there and I was surprised. There is not even a section file on the former Prime Minister of India, Mr. Deve Gowda. All that I could pull out, which is there in the first section of the book, all the letters that I quote, everything that he writes in such eloquent English to Nijlingappa, Morarji, Chandrasekhar, Ramakrishna, all of that is part of the Janata Party papers and it's not even sorted out. So I had to spend about 3 months just, looking into all those Janata Party papers which have been dumped. Because they're still not sorted out at that point of time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example. Archives in India have improved immeasurably over the last 20 years or 30 years, but there's still no default process by which these papers are sent to an archive and sorted for public access. It is still, as you said, Deve Gowda, you had to ask Deve Gowda, get him to trust you to then be able to access these notes. Whereas in another country, they might have just automatically gone to the equivalent of a presidential library or an archive or whatever.
And the prime ministerial, whatever papers had not been declassified because June 2021, he completed 25. And I don't think the declassification process here is very serious. I think Modi is just holding it very close to himself.
Right. We will move quickly to Bollywood and then back to politics. I think it's a nice triangle. But Rajiv, if there are some archives in politics, there are almost none in film, I think. So I'd be very curious to ask you about that. But first, let me ask you to please read a short passage.
I'll read first one short passage from Lakshmikant Behrlal, then one short passage from my first biography, that is Dharmendra. So Lakshmikant Behrlal, everybody knows, were together for... apart from their musical career, they were together as friends and as musicians from the time Lakshmikant ji was about 10 and Pyare Bhai of the same time age, and they were musicians to all the top composers. So Pandit ji, Hari Prasad Chaurasia ji has told me that so many husbands and wives also do not stay together as these two people did. So when they almost split in the early 90s, it caused a sensation. By that time, their commercial clout was so powerful that you'll see what happened when I read this passage. The infamous tiff that shook the industry. Yet, incredibly, Lakshmikant Pyarellal's unbreakable bond almost snapped in 1991. In an impulsive decision made during a concert tour abroad, Pyarelal decided not to work with Lakshmikant, and the latter even recorded a few songs with other arrangers as dates had already been given. Happily, they came back together in less than a fortnight, but their split and reunion became a record event. Not only were their impassioned pleas by trade magazines and a lot of coverage in the media, but top filmmakers like Manoj Kumar, J. Om Prakash, who had then signed Nadeem Shravan out of commercial compulsion. That J. Om Prakash, incidentally, is Hrithik Roshan's maternal grandfather. Bonnie Kapoor, Pankaj Parashar, and more came together and helped in the reunion. Naushad and Lata Mangeshkar also were a part of the peacemaking process. Incidentally, Lakshmikant had also revealed to me, sorry, this is irrelevant, so I'll go to the next paragraph. LP's stardom at that point was also demonstrated by the fact that Dinesh Gandhi, backdoor producer of films like Tezab and Hum, vowed to go on a pilgrimage if they reunited, while Lakshmikant's sister-in-law, actress Bindu, had vowed to feed 500 poor people if they came back together. On this, Subhash Ghai, Jaya Lakshmikant, that's Lakshmiji's wife, and Lakshmikant Pyarelal shed light. Ghai had told me then, two common friends in double inverted commas, were creating all the misunderstandings between them, but I exposed them. These two people were retailers in Mumbai's Midtown Dadar and owned the showroom of a reputed cloth brand. They would even address each other as Lakshmikant and Pyarelal. Intending to soothe ruffled feathers, Ghai had gone to Lakshmikant's house while the two retailers were there, and later went to Pyarelal's house and found them there too. They had apparently told Pyarelal concocted lies about what Lakshmikant and his wife had stated about them. As Ghai told Pyarelal, I was there at Lakshmiji's house. No one said a word against you. These scoundrels are then lying through their teeth. Later, Lakshmikant dismissed the matter with a smile, saying, Pyare was upset about something. And Pyarelal remarked, it was a stupid tantrum on my part during a show abroad when I desperately wanted a glass of water and no one got it. And it seemed that everyone was paying attention to Lakshmi. Otherwise, we had always decided that if anyone told us anything derogatory about the other partner, we would check with each other first. And that's how partnerships should be. And barring that moment of pick, Lakshmikant's Pyarelal's relationship was. So would you like me to read the second?
Let me ask you questions about this passage first, because it's like delicious. Clearly it's an episode from 30 years ago. One of the protagonists is still with us, and as are several of the other people who you've mentioned. Now, one of the other points that I wanted to raise about biography writing in India, not even in book form, but even sort of writing about public personalities in newspapers and magazines, talking about public personalities if you are associated with them, is the act of hagiography, which is that you never say anything bad about your colleague or your boss or your ex-prime minister. You always have to be seen, at least in the public sphere, you always have to be seen as praising them or defending them or being loyal to them. And this, I imagine, is a particularly hard-coded habit in Bollywood. And so now you, as somebody who has written 2 film biographies, who's written so much about film, and especially in this kind of passage where there is something slightly controversial at the heart of it, how do you negotiate that tendency in the industry?
See, firstly, because of my 3 decades in the industry, I have developed with most people, especially in the music field, because that's where I did most of my work. 60% of my work. I've developed a kind of informal friendship with, people. So it goes beyond a mere celebrity journalist bond or rapport. So I know they open up to me.
But does it ever prevent you from writing about them if, for example, they are in the wrong, or does that relationship impact what you write?
I have not written anything yellow in my career till now. That is point number 1. Point number 2, there is a thin line, like you say, between truth and extolling them to the position of gods, which also I think, to my sincere attempts, have not been in that direction, the other direction. So what I came across now, most of the people I met for this book, including, some of the people mentioned here, are, in that sense, people I have met from the 90s till today, off and on. Some people I met in the last decade for the first time. Couple of people I met for the first time for this book. So when I met them again, I already had a rapport. And luckily, or however you look at it, the other people knew there is somebody called Rajiv Vijayakar in the line. So, it's not that I was a stranger or a first timer. So I think, and you can make out, I am a doctor by qualification. One of the subjects we learn as a byproduct, we don't give an exam in it, is psychology, how to deal with patients. So I had a certain amount of, basic feel, and looking at the person's way of expressing and all. And now, since they know you're not going to write any masala, you're going to write facts, the way they come out is different from probably they come out with a masala journalist. I'm not being superior or anything. I'm just stating facts. So it's not very difficult. And knowing, see, somebody is talking about Lakshmikant Behrlal, and I know Lakshmikant Behrlal for 30 years. So that makes the difference. If something doesn't connect, it doesn't fit with what I know about Lakshmikant Behrlal or what other people have told me. Sometimes it's the same incident. In my book, you'll see same song or same incident being described by 2 or 3 different people. So there has to be a certain, what do you say? What's the word? Meeting point, confluence between. Then you can. These are things which I cannot check as in, again, there's no documentation or anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you go to the Hindi film industry is among the poorest archived things in the entire country. I don't know about the politics, but it's very difficult.
Right.
Luckily for this book, at least, I had to access mainly my records apart from meeting people on my own. And I think there's hardly 1 or 2 sources where I'd taken minor things.
Yeah.
And I mean, Lakshmikant and Pyarelal, frankly, are like family, So it is something, that you don't, you can try to hide things from your family, but the family comes to know most of it.
Yeah, because I imagine even if you looked at the newspaper archives of that incident or the records back in the day, you don't know what you can trust and what you can't trust when it's published in the.
See, that is what I tried to verify.
Yeah.
Like Bonnie Kapoor told me that nobody knows there was a split within them, passing split again in the 80s, 10 years before this happened, almost. And the sets of Wo Saat Din. And that's when he said something which is not there in this text. He said, I decided that if they come back together, I'll go and tonsure my head. And he did that. Whereas one song in Wo Saat Din was entirely done by Lakshmikant. At that time, you're so busy that, if you're a partner who's, for practical reasons, taking responsibility for the arrangement parts.
Yeah.
It's not that he can't compose. You have to go ahead because the studios are booked, everything is there, shooting dates are fixed, everything is there, rehearsals are done. So that is,
And the unfortunate thing I assume is that these studios also don't have archives. I mean, as maybe, 20th Century Fox has, or nothing like that exists. Yeah.
I gave Pyarelal about 50 or 60 of his songs, which he didn't have in his collection. Recorded at home from my cassettes.
Wow.
So it's very poorly archived, the industry. Kalyanji Anandji, they tried to archive their own contribution by terms of a book. But even there, Anandji Bhai presented me the book and he said, if you find anything missing, please let me know.
Wow.
So, it's that poorly documented because ye log kalakar hai, they didn't know that they will last so long. Their existence was for their art and music, and they lasted so long, and they did so many films and so many years. So, it is, they didn't predict.
Sure.
It was left to somebody else to, kind of see their work, collect their work and all that.
Right. We should move on because we want to get to Debashish and then to questions from the audience. So last but not least, VP Singh and Debashish Mukherjee, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Saman. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'll also read something from my book. But before that, I'll just give a bit of context. VP Singh is known mainly for 2 things today. He's remembered for just 2 things. I'd say, well, first is the implementation of the Mandal, not really implementation, at least exhuming of the Mandal Commission report, which gave OBCs, central government jobs representation for the first time. And the second is his big fight with Rajiv Gandhi, which led him to leave the Congress party, form the Janata Dal, and indeed defeat Rajiv Gandhi defeat the Congress in the 1989 election. Now, in this extract is entirely from the first part relating to Rajiv Gandhi, because I felt that had a lot of, emotional drama involved. So here we have, I'll just explain the prelude to this. See, when they began, Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh were extremely close. I mean, there are other ministers who said that VP Singh was probably the closest to Rajiv Gandhi. And just as Rajiv Gandhi began an attempt to reform the Congress and reduce political corruption, throwing out what he calls power brokers and so forth, he gave VP Singh carte blanche to act and curb corporate corruption, because VP Singh was made the finance minister. And VP Singh did that with so much zeal that even Rajiv Gandhi was embarrassed. That's what really happened. And certain people, in fact, actually one private company, because VP Singh, I think he locked up some 6,000, he raided some 6,000 business houses, and there were many other, incredible figures where his ED and his DRI and these departments went after corporates. And the main thing was that they didn't go after only those corporates which were opposed to the Congress party or who had helped the opposition. He went after everyone. And that period is now called Raid Raj, in fact, at that time itself. So what happened was that Rajiv Gandhi not only took him away from the finance ministry and made him defense minister. He had to give him something. He transferred him to the defense ministry, but also some people in the Congress began a sort of sustained campaign of calumny against VP Singh, calling him a CIA agent and whatnot, because he had hired an American detective agency to probe this particular company's overseas dealings, foreign exchange dealings. So, and VP Singh then, this being accusation of CIA and all that, VP Singh struck back because he had been moved to defense. Now he tried to find out the defense deals that had happened during his predecessors. And sure enough, he found one where some illegal commission had been paid. Yeah, if you don't have to look too far, that's a gray area. Even now, we've seen this Rafael deal and all that. So this was the HDW, a German firm, which had sold 4 submarines to India. So he announced a probe into that without even consulting Rajiv Gandhi. So Rajiv was furious, absolutely furious, and his reaction seemed to suggest that he knew more about the deal than he let on. And VP Singh had to resign then. And this extract comes just after that, when VP Singh has just resigned as defense minister, but he hasn't yet quit the party, or he hasn't moved on to make the Janata Dal or anything like that. So here goes. Yeah. Rajiv Gandhi's response to VP Singh's resignation was contradictory. On the one hand, the personal attacks by Congress members on VP, begun by Dinesh Singh in Parliament on 31st March 1987, increased, with a couple of MPs in particular, K.K. Tiwari and Kalpanath Rai, going ballistic. American imperialism has found a quisling in VP Singh, was one of Tiwari's milder remarks. At his next meeting, the Congress Working Committee's resolution charged VP with, in quotes, a grand design for destabilization, seeking the country's balkanization, and attempting to undermine the morale of our defense forces. 30 MPs signed a statement accusing VP Singh of immoral conduct in appointing Fairfax. Fairfax was the detective agency he appointed. But on the other, Rajiv also sent emissaries to VP Singh's house, urging reconciliation. A cabinet minister, a top bureaucrat in the Prime Minister's office, and VP's old mentor, Uma Shankar Dikshit, all visited him, claiming that Rajiv was keen on meeting him to resolve their differences. Dikshit, by then in his late 80s, arthritic and leaning heavily on his walking stick, had suddenly been plucked out of his gubernatorial position by Rajiv in mid-1986 and made an AICC office bearer. He was the most persuasive of the three. I'm quite sure Rajiv Gandhi isn't neck deep in the AGW payoff, he said, according to VP's later account. He's nose deep. But what else did you expect? Black money is as crucial to the functioning of a political party as this walking stick is to me. Without this walking stick, I can't even go to the bathroom. You were trying to take away Rajiv Gandhi's walking stick. There was nothing I could really say to that, commented VP, except that political funding needed to be transparent. He even agreed to meet Rajiv twice, but both meetings ended badly. At the first meeting in the Prime Minister's office, VP brought up the sustained slander campaign against him. Day in and day out, people like KK Tiwari and Kalpanath Rai are calling me a CIA agent, he said. I know they're only loudspeakers, and the mic feeding them is located in this room. Rajiv denied it strongly. Our party people are very angry with you, he said. I'm trying to control them. Look, we must stop playing games with each other, VP responded. You've forgotten I worked this Congress machine with your mother, and I know it's every nut and bolt. None of this could have been said without your clearance. You call me a lousy, incompetent minister, and I'm okay with that. But I'm not willing to accept being called a traitor. I'm going to dig in and fight. The second meeting, late on the evening of 22nd May 1987, at the new Prime Ministerial Residence, 7 Racecourse Road, now it's called Lok Kalyan Marg in Delhi, was worse. I remember the date because we had a double celebration planned that day, said Sita Kumari Singh, VP Singh's wife. Abhay, that's a younger son, had just got his postgraduate degree in medicine, and it was also my granddaughter Adrija's birthday, the younger of the other brother's two daughters. We reserved a table for dinner at the India International Center, but my husband did not show up until well after 10 p.m. and seemed very upset when he did. So what happened at the meeting? At the meeting, Rajiv accused VP of having deserted Indira Gandhi after her 1977 Lok Sabha defeat and of staying away from the May 1978 Azamgarh by-election, which Mohsina Kidwai contested as the Congress candidate and unexpectedly won. Whereas VP had actually spent a week in Azamgarh campaigning. VP was finally provoked to counter. How would you know who was with your mother then and who wasn't? If anyone was missing then around her, it was you. So the meeting ended with VP storming out. As far as you are concerned, Vishwanath is dead, he said dramatically. I'm leaving carrying my shroud. No, sit down, sit down. What are you getting angry about? Rajiv said, but VP did not wait. A last emissary arrived. This is Dainik Jagran's proprietor. Dainik Jagran is a well-known Hindi newspaper, Narendra Mohan, to suggest that VP could return as finance minister if he made up with Rajiv. VP turned down a third meeting. I feel insulted by the proposal that I should return as finance minister, he replied. Rajiv Gandhi thinks he can throw me a crumb and I'll succumb. It shows he does not understand me at all. Well,
lovely, so dramatic. I mean, all three passages that have been read out here, and I wanted to pick up, one of the examples of what a good biography does well, the kind of material it brings to the surface, is this exchange between Rajiv and VP Singh, where you're actually quoting their own words back and forth. You want to call me a lousy, incompetent minister, you go ahead, but you can't call me a so walk us through, where did this material come from? How did you find it?
See, I have to say that this is somewhat one-sided in that this is VP Singh's account. Now, this was found in the Nehru Memorial Library, which for all its shortcomings is a real treasure trove, as I told the person in charge, in fact. And in the last years of his life, when he had both cancer and he had that kidney problem and he was undergoing dialysis, VP Singh gave a long interview to the Nehru Memorial Library, which is about 900 pages of transcript. Yeah, and it is kept in its oral history section. In fact, had I not found that, I might not have written this book, because you need to start with something. So that was not my starting point, but without that, this book would not have materialized. And there, this is all in, most of this is recounted. And some of it is from other sources. The main problem here is that nothing of this is in the newspapers. I saw the archives of at least 2 newspapers. And in fact, there VP Singh is asked, did you meet Rajiv Gandhi? And he says, no, we haven't met. And he sent some emissaries, but we haven't met. Whereas in fact, they did. In his own interview to the NMML, he says they did. But there too, he makes and also there is an earlier biography written by Seema Mustafa, I should say. There she makes some reference to one of these 2 meetings and quotes from it also. So my job was really combining what was there in the Nehru Memorial records, plus what Seema Mustafa had said, had written, and a few details from Sita Kumari Singh, who told me who the cabinet minister, the bureaucrat, and this newspaper proprietor, and Uma Shankar Dikshit, that they were at their place. So we put all that together, and whatever I felt was not really gelling, I kept it out. That's also there.
And was it possible or easy to cross-verify with other people in the Congress at the time? I mean, how did you go about triangulating that?
No, I didn't verify it with, I just relied on the records, because Congress people won't remember. And obviously, Rajiv Gandhi is not there to defend himself.
Right, of course.
I recognize that. And who would remember about that so long ago? These were closed door meetings between these 2 people.
Right, of course.
So I had to go, and that feature is there. And this book is from VP Singh's point of view, but it is not a, it questions him on all the things he says.
Right, sure.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 7-8 minutes left. If nobody has a question for these guys, I have one, but I'm going to turn it to the audience first and ask if you have any questions about the art of writing biography, how they went about their work or their books.
This question is for Sugata. I mean, you have seen many politicians in your life as a journalist, but what made you take Devegowda, choose Devegowda for your first book?
Very, very, very interesting, because, as you rightly said, as a journalist, it's a professional thing to sort of meet many journalists, many politicians. And I always felt that Devegowda was much more than what he was being presented in the media. See, I don't want to speak about the lack of diversity in media, in newsrooms, and the kind of, portrayal that was done of Devegowda and all that. So I was very, very suspicious, because whenever I met him, he always came across to me as a man who was hiding his reading. And to confirm that, my mentor, Mr. H.Y. Sharda Prasad, I mentioned that in the book. He told me once, he had come to sort of, from Delhi to Bangalore, he had developed Parkinson's and he was staying with us. And he told me, I was constantly prodding him about Indira Gandhi and his time with, I asked him, why didn't you resign? Things like that. And he once told me, they both came from the same town, Holenarsipur. H and HY is Holenarsipur, and H in Devegowda is also Hardanahalli, but then his constituency has always been Holenarsipur. So he told me something very interesting. He said, if Indira Gandhi knew as much constitutional law as Devegowda, who is a very litigious person, he's studied, a lot of things, she would have never clamped the emergency. So that ignited my curiosity, but I never thought I will do a full-fledged biography. In fact, to be honest, I was offered a choice between Manmohan Singh and Devegowda. And I clearly chose Devegowda because it's a far more colorful character, far more interesting. See, Manmohan Singh is a technocrat. You can't write much and he wouldn't speak much. Devegowda is a very colorful man, and mass leaders are people who have battled emotions. So if a biography does not capture emotion, then it becomes very boring. So, it can't be written just on archival thing. I've tried to verify as much as I can. I've tried to dig in. I've done 80 interviews for the book, some off record, some on record. And as a rule. I have quoted people who deserted him. B.L. Shankar is a big source. P.G.R. Sindhya, who fought an election and won against him, is a big source. I have spoken to everybody. So Deve Gowda was much more than his imperfections that were being put out. And that's the phrase from Pratap Banu Mehta. He says that about Nehru. Yeah. Nehru is much more than the sum of his imperfections. So I try to say that Deve Gowda is much more than the sum of his imperfections and all our prejudices and misjudgments. I hope I've answered.
Lovely, very nice. We have one more question. I think that's all we'll have time for. So one last question from you.
Sorry. Thank you. I again have a question for Mr. Sugata. Sir, you mentioned that like Mr. Deve Gowda never cared for his his media image, and he blamed his staff that they never actually took care of my image. Do you think what is the school of thought they come from? Because if you want to live in that public space, you have to care for the public image, because that is what actually goes as your message, or how you conduct your life, and people relate to that. Why do you think Gowda or anybody in that who come from that school of thought, they didn't care about their their public image?
This is something very, very, even Devraj Aras said this. Devraj Aras was the chief minister and Deve Gowda was his opposition leader. Devraj Aras used to, while looking at these archives and paper, he used to tell the newspaper walas who never supported his chief ministership for the first 3 years. He would say, I don't care, you write what you want. People who vote for me will not read your newspapers. But that is the school of thought that even Deve Gowda comes from. He never spent a single penny, all his 70 years, on any PR establishment or an image management firm, unlike an S.M. Krishna or a Ram Krishna Hegde or the great Mr. Narendra Modi. So Deve Gowda, he has won election. See, that is proof of his thing. From 62 on, or 1954, the first election to the Taluk board of Holenarsipur, to the 2019 election when he sort of lost. He has contested elections and he has been elected, defeated. See, with mass leaders, what happens is that people punish you, they hug you back, they cry, they throw stones at you, but then, there is a different kind of bond. And that bond is not created by any of us writing in the newspapers. We think that we are very important people. I don't think we do anything to, otherwise Modi would not have won because there was so much of media against.
Yeah. Fantastic. On that note, whether the journalists and newspapers are important or not, biographers are, and I'm so glad that the three of you wrote the books that you did and enriched this genre, which needs much more enrichment still. Thank you so much, Sugata and Debashish and Rajiv, and thank you to the Bangalore Lit Fest for having us all here talking about this.